Welcome back. In this lecture, we'll continue to discuss essay development. Last week, you learned about narration, exemplification, description, and process writing. This week, we'll consider cause and effect, comparison and contrast, definition, division, classification, and argument. Ready to get started? Let's begin. Surely you've heard the phrase cause and effect, right? Things in life cause other things in life to happen. When it rains, this causes the grass to become wet. Put another way, wet grass is the effect of rain. Let's try another. My hunger caused me to eat lunch. So eating lunch was the effect of my hunger. Of course, if we create an essay and use cause and effect, we aren't merely going to be writing single sentences that discuss the rain or why we ate lunch. Instead, we'll write an essay that explains to our audience the causes of a particular event or situation. Or we might explain the effects of an event or situation. Assume your topic was to write a paper on the effects of not getting enough sleep. Do you see how that paper would be about effects? Some of these effects, if you're like me when you don't get enough sleep, might include irritability, nausea, and drowsiness. For a fully developed essay, you might describe each of these effects in detail. Say you were asked to write a paper explaining why you enrolled in online education. This paper would describe what caused you to become an online student. What did cause you to become an online student, by the way? Other times we must compare and contrast in our writing. Certainly these are terms you've heard before too. When we compare two things, we show how they are similar. For example, pens and pencils are both used to write. When we contrast two things, we show how they are different. Pens and pencils might both be used to write, but pencils need sharpening, and we can often erase the marks of a pencil. Pens can't be sharpened or erased. Comparison and contrast essays pose a special challenge in the Department of Organization. Luckily, there are a few different formulas we can use in order to present our information clearly and effectively. We can either present details one at a time or point by point. Let's consider both methods. If we present details in a comparison or contrast essay one side at a time, we must first look at only one side of our argument. If I were to write a paper contrasting the east and west coasts of the U.S., here's an example of presenting only one at a time. On the East Coast, where I'm from, the winters are cold and the summers are hot, very hot. The humidity makes it hard to breathe, especially in the summertime. This makes me thankful that I grew up along the coast. The cities on the East Coast are close together, and the population is extremely dense. Many states make up the chain from Maine to Florida, and the people who live in those states speak with a variety of dialects. On the West Coast, where I live now, the climate is much more constant. Summers are warm and winters can be cool, but I never feel overly hot or cold. There's not much humidity, and there's also not much rain. The cities on the West Coast are fairly spread out, and the coastal population is quite sparse. Only 3 states make up the entire coastline: Washington, Oregon, and California. Do you see how I first spoke about the East Coast and then the West Coast? Now let's look at how to present information point by point. I'll use the East Coast-West Coast example again. On the East Coast, where I'm from, the winters are cold and the summers are hot. However, on the West Coast, where I live now, the climate is much more constant. Summers here are warm and winters can be cool, but I never feel overly hot or cold the way I did when I lived back east. Although the humidity is brutal on the East Coast, there is hardly any humidity at all on the West Coast. The cities on the East Coast are close together, yet the cities on the West Coast seem to be more spread apart. And although there is a long string of states that make up the chain from Maine to Florida, only 3 states line the West Coast: Washington, Oregon, and California. Do you see the difference? In this example, I first spoke about climate of both coasts. Then I spoke about the cities, and finally I spoke about the coastal states. I did not talk about strictly the East Coast and then strictly the West Coast. Instead, I broke my essay down by points, which in my opinion was more effective. Next, let's talk about definition essays. Sometimes when we talk to people, we offer informal definitions to explain what we mean by a particular term. If I say that my friend is loud, you probably know what loud means. But if I say that I can hear my friend on a crowded street from a block away, that gives you a better definition of what I mean by loud in this particular situation, doesn't it? Defining what I mean this way is also much more interesting than simply saying, my friend is loud. Perhaps you're thinking that offering a definition in writing is similar to writing descriptively. If you're thinking this, you're absolutely correct. The difference is that when we write a description essay, often the entire essay is based on a definition, whereas solid descriptions can be used throughout any essay. For example, you might be asked to write an essay about what it meant to be a daughter or son, a Democrat or a Republican, a student, a resident of your town. These topics would call for you to create an essay defining who a person is in this role. Examples and description would be used to achieve this. I'll generate a short example for you. I'm bad at returning phone calls. There's just not enough time in the day to speak to all the people who call me. I know that sounds kind of conceited, and I don't mean it that way. It's just that I'm a very busy person. I work, try to get enough sleep, cook, clean, sit in traffic, and because I'm so frequently occupied, I just can't seem to ever find the time to return calls. I check my voicemail once a week, if that. I just let the voicemails pile up, and then eventually I'll sift through them and make a few return calls. But I'm never able to catch up. Really, my life is no busier than the people who call me, I'm sure. I'm just not adept at returning calls. Do you see how in this paragraph I defined someone who is bad at returning phone calls? Do you see how doing so made the essay much more compelling than if I had simply said, I'm a person who doesn't return phone calls? There are two more essay development techniques I'd like to discuss: division, classification, and argument. Let's look at division classification first. This technique comes in handy when you have a category of information to describe. I like your textbook's example. It divides and classifies clothing into 4 categories in a few different ways. Clothing can be sorted into clothing that covers the top part of our bodies, the bottom part of our bodies, our feet, and our neck and head. So this division is based on part of the body. But we can also talk about clothing in another way, what it's made of. We might have clothing that's made of polyester, wool, leather, or cotton. Or if it suits us better, we can talk about clothing based on style. There's clothing that's in style, out of style, and clothing that has never been in style. Let's try one more example. This time, let's talk about books. How might you classify books? I can think of a few different ways. I might write about books based on the genre that they're in. We have fiction, which includes novels and novellas, poetry, literary nonfiction, which includes memoirs and essays, and other nonfiction, which might include biographies, travel guides, and informative books about just about any subject. But surely this isn't the only way to classify books. I might instead consider books by when they're written. Books might be contemporary, which means that they were written recently. Others were written in the 19th century. Others even earlier. Yet another way to classify books is to categorize them by what they're about. Some books might be about romance, others about parenting, others about pets, others about traveling. I think you see where I'm going here. As with all other types of essays, it is important to keep your audience in mind when working on a division classification essay. Check out the sample essays in this chapter of your textbook for further examples of division classification essays. Then try one of your own. Finally, let's look at how to develop an argument in an essay. Developing sound and compelling arguments is an important skill in everyday life. You might persuade your parents to lend you money, your car repairman to give you a discount, your local community to vote on a certain issue, or just about anything else. Understanding the components of an argument will also help you become a stronger critical thinker with the ability to question advertisements, newspaper articles, political speeches, and other persuasive messages you hear on a daily basis. To develop an argument in writing, you must defend your position with a series of solid reasons. Just as in all the other types of essays you might create, you need to make a point and support it. The difference is that essays that argue something often present a controversial point, or one that some of your readers might not agree with. Let's consider some specific argument writing strategies. First, use tactful and courteous language. If you want to persuade people to think the way you do, it's important that you don't anger or offend them. Focus on the issue that you're discussing. Don't disparage those who might not think like you. Instead, simply tell them what you think and why you think that way. You should also point out common ground. Find opinions that you might share with your readers, especially those readers who might not agree with you. If you're attempting to argue that the new corporate supermarket is not going to do your community good, you might say something like, "Sure, we all appreciate a good value, but..." Do you see how even though some people might be in favor of the new supermarket while others are not, you're finding common ground? You know that everyone appreciates a good value on their food. You can bond with your reader on this point and then use it as leverage to make your argument. When arguing in writing, it's a good idea to acknowledge points of view that differ from your own. Ignoring points of view that conflict with your own isn't going to make them go away. Instead, acknowledging others' reasons for thinking about issues differently than you do will allow you to appear informed and intelligent. And if you come across a point that is valid and strong, acknowledge that point. Admit the merit of an opposing point of view if it deserves merit, but make it clear that your argument is stronger. And whenever you can, show your reader where an opposing argument is weak. Let's consider an example. Although the addition of a new movie theater in town might appeal to some people, I worry that it might prevent people in our community from being active and making use of our many parks. We already have 3 theaters in town, all within a half-mile radius of one another. Some might think that another theater will help the town's economy. I agree that it might, but I suspect that the benefits to the economy will not outweigh the costs. We, as a coastal California town, have fantastic weather and many parks. We need to encourage members of our community to get outside and enjoy this beautiful place we're fortunate to live in. If we had yet another movie theater, we'll be giving our community yet one more indoor activity to partake in. Instead of another theater, let's organize hikes, bike excursions, kayaking, and whale-watching adventures. Do you see how in the argument above I make my point, but also recognize an opposite point of view? That people want another movie theater because it will boost the economy. I didn't insult anyone who might think this way. Instead, I validated their argument, but made my own.